You want to know how I know this is an excellent episode? They managed to deliver a better child kidnapping scene than Disney did with all of its Star Wars money for Obi-Wan. Hello interwebs, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of The Orville, this time Season 3, Episode 8, Midnight Blue. And I am just going to say this right up front. This, quite possibly, is my favorite episode of The Orville so far. This just knocked it out of the park on every single level. This was an episode that could only have been done after several weeks of excellent buildup. Like, if they had done this as episode 2 or episode 3 of this season, it would not have worked. But the fact that they have been building up this Topa storyline, as well as the Mocklin storyline that has been going on for several seasons now, as well as just the simmering background of all the political intrigue with things like the Kalon, adding sort of background tension to everything going on here, and all the political intrigue dovetailing with personal stories in a really excellent way. Like, this is, honest to God, one of my favorite episodes of not only this show, but of this year so far. I am kind of in shock at how good this show has been this season, and this episode just delivers on every single front. I'm honestly, I just finished watching the episode, so I'm a little bit speechless here. I just think that this is a really excellent episode that just delivered on every front and does what a good show telling a episodic yet serialized story should do, and just build all of it in through interpersonal drama while also building political intrigue on a galactic scale. I think that this really brings to a head so many of the storylines, not just the ones with the Mocklins, but as I mentioned before, everything with the Kalons as a simmering threat, because what happens in this episode makes everything going on with the Kalons even more dangerous, which I'm sure will be even more of a problem going into the final 2 episodes of the season. So let's get into this and break this episode down, because I have so much to say, but this truly, I think, was a master episode on every level. As per usual, I'll go through and break this down scene by scene, and we'll go through the episode bit by bit. And again, apologies that I'm not on camera. I will hopefully be on camera next week. I know that I've said that for a while, but the reason I haven't been is I've been working on my face reveal video for my main channel, so that'll actually be going up next week. So you'll actually be able to see my face next week. I'm basically just hiding my face at this point to save it for that reveal video, because I want that to be that special moment, because I have a few things that I want to say and talk about within that video. So be on the lookout for that video. That's all I'll say about it here, but you'll get to see my beautiful face starting next week for these reviews. But let's get into this. Going forward, basically we're getting a movie-length Orville episode. Like, this was an hour and a half, and I was a bit worried considering my issues with some of the pacing of the previous episodes of this season being a little bit overlong, in my opinion. But here, I think the pacing works just absolutely wonderful. Even scenes that I thought might not have worked in terms of pacing end up working for me, and I'll talk about those when I get there. But I do really, really enjoy these opening sequences that we have with Topa kind of dealing with feelings for a boy, and then we ultimately learn that it's Gordon. I think these are very sweet scenes, right from Kelly sort of telling Topa, like, look, I'm here, you can talk to me if you need to, not pressuring Topa to talk to her, but just allowing her, and then she opens up to her of her own volition. And then also Bortus connecting with Kelly as well, which is sort of be coming up throughout the episode in a way I did not expect. And then the scene where Topa goes to Gordon and sort of asks him out on a date, and it takes Gordon a while to understand what's actually going on, was absolutely hysterical. I thought all of that was wonderful. And then also the line that we get from, I forget the character's name, but Norm Macdonald's character, saying he's looking better going than coming. I thought all of that was just really funny, and I really adored it. And it was very clear that this scene was done to kind of show us a little bit of slice of life of Topa, like what Topa does every single day now that she has come out. And I have a few things about this. I think my only real concern with this is I loved it how it's portrayed, but I also would have liked this type of scene to have been in like another episode, like maybe last episode or something like that, just because when you spread it out over multiple episodes, it feels like it's happening over a longer sense of time. Whereas here it's very clear that the show is just trying to get you to like see Topa's daily life, so that when they disrupt it in the next few scenes later on in this episode, you kind of understand like, oh, this is the disruption of that life. And I think it would have worked better just to spread that out over multiple episodes. But again, we don't have Star Trek The Next Generation amount of episodes here. We don't have like 22 or 26 episodes a year now. So I understand what's kind of crammed in here. It's just like something thing that I would have preferred over multiple episodes. And then another kind of critique here, and this is just more from a personal point of view, is that when we see this, like, Topa's like wanting to date a boy and she's kind of figuring out her sexuality, and it feels very matter of fact. And I know there's like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of struggle on Topa's part in terms of dealing with her sexuality or how she feels about boys. And I think that can definitely happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. And maybe I'm just overreading my own personal point of view, but as someone who also came out as transgender, I had a lot of difficulty dealing with my sexuality because it was mixing with my gender identity. And while Topa's certainly much more firm in her understanding of her gender identity at a much younger age than it took me, because it took me, into, my college years to really come out and do all those things, I still would have liked to honestly see her sort of questioning, like, oh, do I like boys? What's that sort of thing? It just sort of like shoved her into just knowing her sexuality right out of the gate, which is, again, not wrong. I've just seen that as a thing that many trans people go through. And so it would have been an interesting story, I guess is the thing to say. It's not bad as depicted. I just think that, there would have been an interesting story to display there, because it would have been cool to see that. But it's not a knock against the episode, just a personal preference as someone with my own identity that kind of identifies a little bit with Topa's experience. I would have been interested to see that, but not something that the episode was needing to do by any means. But then we get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, where we learn that we're going back to Havina's planet, who was the Mocklin woman who stood up for Topa back in season 1, and we learned that she had her own planet in season 2, and it got protective status, and they're sort of doing an audit of the planet in order to make sure that they're abiding by the Mocklin Union agreement that they came up with last season. So I thought this was an interesting sort of political setup. I was like, okay, I'm curious to see where they're going to go with this. And I also loved that Topa comes to board and said, look, I would really love to meet Havina. She's someone I looked up to. Like, obviously, Topa would venerate this woman who's the one representation she has, and also is someone that writes all these books and has these theories. I mean, I had the same thing when I was growing up. As a young kid, I would look at trans people growing up, like Lynn Conway, if anyone knows who she is. I would just sort of read their stories in secret to kind of get a little bit representation of what I could. So of course, Topa would have veneration of Havina here. And I love Bortus just throughout this entire episode. Bortus just being a worried and concerned but caring father and willing to give his daughter chances while also being worried for her safety. Just great across the board. Every single moment with Bortus. And we'll talk about the dark moment later on. But every moment with Bortus throughout this episode was just super sweet. And I think he's just spot on. A great parent. And I adored him front to back. Who would have thought Bortus of all characters is making me go oh my god, I just want to give you a hug. He was a character I did not love in prior seasons, but now I adore him. I adore him in every way. Speaking of Bortus being a protective father, I did like that we get down to the planet and we see the depersoning of Topa by the Mocklin investigators here. They call her disgusting and things like that. So I was just like, that kind of fits. I've, as a trans person, a queer person, definitely faced words just like that. So that made sense to me. And then we see the colony of women, and I just couldn't help but thinking of Theramascara and Wonder Woman. I'm like, I'm sure they're all just gal pals down here. There's a lot of lesbians on this island. It just kind of made me think about that. I thought it was just a random thought. But then we get a wonderful scene between Havina and Topa. I love that Havina was just supportive of Topa and just sort of taking her around, being a good mentor. All of that was great. And how Havina says, look, I failed you, and Topa saying, no, you just took a little bit longer. All of that was wonderful. Then everything to do with the festival was also great. Bortus being adorable. And I was like, oh, are they leaning into a Kelly-Bortus relationship? Interesting. Not what I would have expected, but weirdly kind of works considering how much we've seen Kelly be involved in Topa's life. So that all worked. And then Topa getting her gay little firefly rainbow moment I thought was also sweet. And just Havina here was super interesting because she's clearly, now that we know her intentions, was being being overtly emotionally manipulative of Topa, using her role as mentor to get Topa to do what she wants. And while she does it in as nice a way as you could do that type of manipulation, it is a manipulation. What other choice, as Ed later calls out, what other choice was Topa going to make? She's her mentor and hero. Of course she's going to do this. And when Havina says, will you help us with the revolution? Of course she's going to say yes. And my thoughts on this is kind of a place of understanding Ed's point of view later on, where he says it's not fair at all to put a child in this position. She's a kid, and you don't force her into a position like this where she really doesn't have a full understanding and grasp of the dangers that she's going to put herself in. That being said, while I do not agree with Havina, I understand completely. There are thousands of lives on the line of this Underground Railroad of getting kids off of Mocklin, and if you only have one way through this kid, I understand why she took it. That's not to say it's right. That's not to excuse her of it, but I understand it completely. And that's the kind of moral dilemmas that I love shows like this talking about, where it's like, I know what I would choose, but I understand the other side completely, where it's not completely black and white, but absolutely gray, even though there is a clear right side to the conversation. I thought that was a really, really, really good sequence and a good moral dilemma to sort of hang the beginning part of this episode on. Then we kind of get a little bit of a forced sequence where Topa goes wandering off in the woods because she's the dumb little kid, and then she gets kidnapping. I will say the child napping, like I joked about earlier, is better than was done in Star Wars Obi-Wan Kenobi. That child napping scene was all sorts of awkward. This was done much better than that, but certainly still a little bit forced in getting her out in the woods to be kidnapped. But then we have a little bit of a search for her, and Kelly and Bortus go out into space to try and run after her. And I love the moment where Kelly says, well, we can either go back to the Orville or we can go search for Topa. And Bortus doesn't even say anything, and Kelly knows what his decision is. And so they go off to chase after Topa. Like, it just works so well, and I love just the relationship that we're seeing building between Kelly and Bortus, and also the trust of the audience to understand that we know where they're going to go. It's obvious. We don't need to state it. I thought that was really, really good writing on every level and well performed as well. Then I normally wouldn't talk about a scene like this, but we do get a quick little scene with Topa on the Moclan ship, and Topa sort of asking questions about where they're taking her and things like that. And the Moclan guard sort of yelling at her and depersoning her through her surgery, saying like, did you scream like this when they took your, obviously referring to her penis, that probably was taken away from her surgery. And again, that is something that rings true to a trans experience. As a trans woman who has also had a bottom surgery like that, I have had a lot of people dehumanize my own body, saying like, oh, you're a mutilated body, you have a mutilated penis and things like that. So it's something that I personally have experienced from bigots being transphobic. And so that scene read entirely true that would happen to Topa, that they would deperson her through her surgeries. Definitely been done. Then we get Ed arriving at Havina and figuring things out, breaking the treaty and kind of bringing Havina in. And I love that he calls out Havina, saying like, look, I know there's more to this story. And they have the argument that I just sort of outlined earlier. And I agree with Ed, him being like, look, she's a child. What other choice was she going to have? And I think this is a great argument. I love that Havina just is morally staunch on her side, being like, look, I did the right thing. I know I have people that I want to save, and I understand where she's coming from, but I love Ed's line, don't hide your opportunism as pious morality. Such a great line. I love that. Like, mwah, like Ed in this scene was pitch perfect. Really adored it. And I love that we get this interesting, again, moral conundrum on top of that, because if Havina admits to this, they can get the Union government to send an investigation after Topa, but it would mean putting Havina's colony in jeopardy because it would no longer have legal protections. So that was all great. And I love the way that Ed gets Havina to agree to release Topa is a wonderful scene with Dolly Parton. Like, holy crap, a Dolly Parton cameo. I am not the biggest Dolly Parton fan, but even I was just sort of like, oh my God, that's Dolly Parton. That's really wonderful. And we kind of get a theme throughout the episode that I'll kind of, I think, subtly recurs at the end. I'll point it out when we get there, but she says, look, if you do the right thing now, the future has a way of working out. And that obviously happens in the long term of just this episode, but I think it's also subtly hinting at the rest of the season storyline as well. So I thought that was just a really lovely scene for Dolly Parton, just a great get by this show. But then we get Topa being brought to this deserted planet, and I'm going to be honest, the child beating scene was really hard to watch. There was very clear tension throughout the scene. It really built up to the moment where you're like, are they really going to show a child getting tortured? And they did. And it was well placed. It was not the tensest scene I have ever seen in my life, but for what this episode was doing, I think it was very effective. And again, for like a PG-13 showing of this, like it wasn't rated R. It wasn't Star Trek Discovery Season 1 torture, but for a PG-13 storyline of showing child torture, it was very effective for that. And this started getting us into a lot of tension with Kelly and Bortus getting down to the planet and them going to rescue Topa. I initially had a moment, once they get down to the planet, there's that sequence where they're trying to get into the base and they jump over that cliff, and I was like, oh, this feels like padding. This episode's already overlong. Why are we doing this whole, like, them sitting in the base? Oh, she's gonna fall. But it did allow them a moment where they could talk, and we get this Kelly-Bortus romance moment where Bortus says, like, you're part of our family, and it works for me. Again, I would not have expected this romance, but it works. I really love it. And I also love it on the back of the fact that Kelly has a more friendship relationship with Ed. I'm glad that we're over in the season 1 and 2, like, oh, shucks, I wish I could get back with my old wife. And that Ed and Kelly have grown into a more just like friendly relationship, and that allows for scenes like this between Kelly and Bortus, which will then lead to a love triangle we'll probably see in further episodes between Bortus, Kelly, and Clyden, because Clyden will be coming back at the end of the episode. So all of this just really complicated storytelling that I just think, again, builds off of everything that this show has been doing so far. But again, when we get back to the child torture scenes and we get this, again, tension building of like, will Topa reveal the name before they get to her? And the action sequences are actually pretty good. Like, I'm used to Star Trek-esque action sequences, at least in this style, before modern Star Trek, which also has a bit better action. But this is, again, not like in the same like action blockbuster feel of like Star Trek Strange New Worlds or Discovery, but for what this episode was doing, it was a very well done action sequence where you get to see them being tactical. It felt like two people really could take on this many people because they were doing it very smart. So I thought that all of that worked pretty well. But then Bortus getting and saving Topa, and then brutally beating the fuck out of the guy that tortured Topa, I understood on every level. Look, I am not someone to be like, but like, this was his kid. His kid got brutally tortured. Yeah, fuck that guy and fuck his other eye. I totally understood Bortus there, and yeah, it was very understandable. But then we jump over to the rest of the storyline where we kind of have Havina testifying before the Union Council. And again, the Mocklins playing politics where there's no valid reason to investigate. Again, this is a good political storyline because it's like, yeah, everyone in that council chamber knows the Mocklins are full of shit. But obviously, on a legal basis, they don't have really much to go on. So it's all just like pomp and circumstance protecting this really horrible government. And I love that when we get the smaller scene later on, that Gordon just calls him out. And like, good on Gordon. I understand, again, politics like doing its own thing and you have to maneuver in the way politics say. But Gordon just being like, nah, fuck these people. You're always hide behind your like, oh, our culture is it's unique and you have to accept our culture. Like, no, screw your culture. It's horrible and bigoted. And we're going to have to say that. And I'm finally like, oh my God, we don't have to deal with this prime directive bullshit. Where it's like, oh, every culture is sacred and we can't interfere. Like, no, Mocklin culture is fucking awful and we should say as such. And I'm finally glad that Gordon just cut through the political bullshit. I thought that was such a cathartic scene, even though it didn't ultimately do anything in the long run in terms of like politics. I thought that was such a cathartic scene for us as the audience that we really, really needed. But then we get the Mocklins annulling Havina's planet and saying that we're going to go invade and take back Havina's planet. But then we get Topa, Bortus, and Kelly striding into the council chamber. And clearly this was done for dramatic effect. I mean, I feel like their first duty should have been to get Topa to a doctor. Like, Topa really needed a doctor in this moment. Like, I don't think that they would just stroll in, like, we're going to run into the council chamber in our tactical gear. It's fine. Security's not going to stop us. It was very clearly a done for dramatic effect moment. But it worked. I'm willing to forgive. I'm really willing to set aside my disbelief for moments like this because it was really, really good with Bortus calling out the Mocklins saying, like, these people need to pay for their crimes and everyone just standing up. I thought all of that was great. And I loved the scene after this where Havina apologizes to Bortus and Bortus saying, like, that's a reasonable expectation that I'm not going to accept your apology, and then just walking away. And we get that Mocklus is expelled from the Union, and we get the thing where the Kaylons are now in a stronger position because the Union does not have Mocklus to back us up, which I'm sure will play into future episodes of the season. So I'm loving that all these complicated politics that we've been building throughout the Orville this entire season and through prior seasons are all coming to a head here, and I'm sure will cause a major problem in the season finale or next episode with the Kaylon threat probably coming to a head in those episodes. But I do want to call out that if you remember, Dolly Parton said, the future has a way of working out if you do the right thing in the moment. And so I'm like, I love that subtly echoed in my mind here because it's like, oh, they did the right thing here. They stood up to the Mocklins. And yes, that put them in a vulnerable position with the Kaylon, but as Dolly Parton says, the future has a way of working out. And I love that wasn't drawn attention to. No one said it. It wasn't like Havina saying like, oh yeah, Dolly Parton told me this, but it was a subtle thematic thread that tugged at the back of my mind in this moment. I thought it was perfection. Great writing, trust in the audience, loving it. But then it brought us to the moment that just made me cry, which was Clyden coming back for Topa. And I'm initially, he was like, oh, he's doing the bare minimum. But his apology to Topa was super sweet. It acknowledged that he was the wrong one who had done wrong, that it was his bigotry. And he accepts Topa for who she is fully and completely. It was honestly a heartbreaking moment. And I loved it. I really loved it. It just tugged at my heartstrings and really paid off everything that has been going on with this family for the past season or so. And I thought it was really, really wonderful. And sorry to like bring it to modern day politics. I know somebody's going to yell about it being woke, but I think it's important to draw out here because there have been so many people that have misread Topa's storyline. There's been a lot of people that have said, oh, Topa's storyline is actually an anti-transgender narrative. And I've talked about that in other videos, both on this channel and my main channel. So check this out if you want to know how the storyline is actually, pro-accepting trans people and how Topa does actually represent a trans experience in many ways. But one thing that I do want to call out here on that note is that Clyden talked about facing having to do a lifetime of prejudice against Topa and against women in his society. And I'm just going to point out, do cis people, non-trans people, have to face that much prejudice? No. So if we're talking about prejudice within these storylines and the way that it's equated to human society today, what allegory this is saying, it's clearly about trans people, because trans people do face this stigmatization and prejudice and misunderstanding and misinformation about us throughout our the entire history of Western culture. And so, again, I hate to make it about that for just a minute here, but I think it's important to point out this allegory because it's like, this is what this is about. It's about undoing preconceptions and prejudices that many people have against anybody, but in specific trans people, which is what this storyline is being allegorically used for. Intersex people, women, and trans people in kind of a mixed way. I still have issues with how this storyline was used in prior seasons, which is creating problems a little bit in explaining the metaphor of it nowadays to audiences watching this in season 3. But within season 3, I think that this has been just wonderfully used. So issues with season 1 and 2 of The Orville aside, excellently done here in season 3. Which brings us to the final scene of the episode, where we get Kelly coming into an awkward dinner with Bortus's family, and that they were announced their Mocklin citizenship, and Kelly gets to sit with their family, but it just sort of leaves me like, are we going to get an interesting little polyamorous family here? Because I'd be down for a Bortus, Clyde, and Kelly polyamorous romance. Like, if they do that, 100% here for it. Or like Kelly and Bortus getting to see each other while Clyden's still there to be a parent to Topa. So I'm curious to see how that storyline is going to go with that love triangle there. But at the end of the day, this was just great. What an emotional episode. What a complicated episode built on everything that the Orville has been doing. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to be hard pressed to say that, that there's any episode this year that has been better in my mind. Like, there might be some, like, I'm sure I could think of others, like Severance has been an amazing TV show this year. Certainly that would probably be one of my personal favorites of all the shows, but and just my own nerdy, dorky heart and loving Star Trek-like shows and Star Trek shows, this was top-notch. Truly top-notch. Fantastic. I have so many adjectives, but I've already been ranting for 24 minutes here, so I'm going to finish out this review just saying this was a great episode. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and that's it. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Like I announced earlier on in this review, I have my face reveal coming up next week on the main channel, so go subscribe over there so you don't miss it. I also have a comedy video coming out on that channel later this week as well. I'm going to try and review Nope later on this week. I'm hopefully going to see Jordan Peele's Nope in the next few days, so if you're curious on my thoughts on that movie, I will hopefully try to get a review up of that depending on when I get to see it and my time, but if not, I will see you all next week for my review of The Orville episode 9. I'm deeply looking forward to it, so thank you so much, and I hope you all live long and prosper.